So let's talk about dopamine. Most people have heard of dopamine, and we hear all the time now about dopamine hits. But actually, there's no such thing as a dopamine hit. Dopamine is incredible because it can change the way that our neural circuits work at a local scale and at a very broad scale. The way that your body uses dopamine is to have a baseline level of dopamine, meaning an amount of dopamine that's circulating in your brain and body all the time. When you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. In the neuroscience literature, we refer to this as tonic and phasic release of dopamine. Tonic being the low-level baseline that's always there circulating, released into your brain all the time, and then phasic, these peaks that ride above that baseline. And those two things interact. But in diseases like Parkinson's or Lewy body's dementia, which is similar to Parkinson's in many ways, there's a depletion or death of dopamine neurons at a particular location in the brain, which leads to shaky movements, challenges in speaking, challenges in particular in initiating movement. We've got these two pathways, one mainly for movement, right? This is the substantia nigra to dorsal striatum. And we've got this other pathway, the so-called mesocortical limbic pathway, that's for reward, reinforcement, and motivation. Many drugs, and indeed many supplements that increase dopamine, will actually make it harder for you to sustain dopamine release over long periods of time and to achieve those peaks that most of us are craving when we are in pursuit of things. Dopamine can also engage in what's called volumetric release. Volumetric release is like a giant vomit that gets out to 50 or 100 or even thousands of cells. It works through what are called G-protein coupled receptors. So what happens is dopamine is released in these little vesicles that I mentioned before, get vomited out into the synapse. It's kind of like a bucket brigade of one thing getting handed off to the next, to the next, to the next. It's G-protein coupled receptors. And anytime you hear about these GPCRs or G-protein coupled receptors, pay attention because they're really interesting. They're slow, but they also can have multiple cascades of effects. They can impact even gene expression at some level. This aspect of dopamine transmission is important because it now underscores two things. One, there's two pathways for dopamine to communicate, one for movement, one for motivation and craving. One thing that's not often discussed about dopamine, but is extremely important to know, is that dopamine doesn't work on its own. Neurons that release dopamine co-release glutamate. Dopamine tends to stimulate sympathetic arousal. It tends to bring an animal or a human into a state of more alertness, readiness, and desire to pursue things outside the confines of its skin. So if I were to just put a really simple message around dopamine, it would be there's a molecule in your brain and body that when released tends to make you look outside yourself, pursue things outside yourself, and to crave things outside yourself. Dopamine is converted into noradrenaline, norepinephrine, it's also called, and norepinephrine is converted into adrenaline. So not only are dopamine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, close cousins, they are actually family members. Okay? What dopamine does is dopamine really colors the subjective experience of an activity to make it more pleasureful, to make it something that you want more of. Epinephrine is more about energy. Epinephrine alone can be fear, paralysis, trauma, not physical paralysis, but mental paralysis, frozen in fear or being traumatized or scared. But the addition of dopamine to that chemical cocktail, if dopamine is released in the brain, well then that epinephrine becomes one of excitement. All of us have different baseline levels of dopamine. Some of this is sure to be genetic. Some people just simply ride at a level a little bit higher. They're a little bit more excited. They're a little bit more motivated. Or maybe they're a lot more excited or a lot more motivated. Dopamine is one currency of craving, motivation, and desire and pleasure. And it's the way that you track pleasure. It's the way that you track success. It's the way that you track whether or not you are doing well or doing poorly. A fascinating result that really underscores what dopamine is capable of in our brains and bodies, and underscores the fact that just through behaviors, no drugs, nothing of that sort, just through behaviors, we can achieve terrifically high increases in dopamine that are very long and sustained in ways that serve us. Dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us. Even subtle fluctuations in dopamine really shape our perception of life and what we're capable of and how we feel.